Okay, thank you everybody. I think we'll commence now. So thank you very much for joining us and welcome to today's webinar on why spotting a breach is more important than stopping it. In this session, we aim to demonstrate how early breach detection can significantly reduce the impact of a data breach. We will provide you with strategies and solutions for responding to new threats, such as crypto mining, and we will offer practical guidance on how to get started with breach detection. But before we commence the webinar, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's session. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel on the right. We would be delighted to hear from you, of course. You can send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and then we will address them during the Q&A at the end. We will be recording the webinar today, so please do sit back, relax, and enjoy the session. So I would like now to introduce today's great speakers. We have our in-house security expert, Max Pritchard, who is pre-sales consultant at ActiveReach. And we are also delighted to welcome Ian Thornton-Trump as our guest speaker and industry expert. Ian is head of cybersecurity at AMTrust International and has a wealth of experience in data breach prevention and detection. So I will now hand over to our speakers, and Max will talk first on dwell time and the detection deficit.
Thank you, Lorna. Hello, everyone. My name is Max. I'm pre-sales consultant at ActiveReach, and I've been in network security for 25 years. In that time, I've met with and discussed security with hundreds of UK businesses of different types and sizes, understanding their challenges, trying to protect their data, of course, within the limits of their budget, resources, and how much their board understands the risks involved with networking. Now, some investment in protecting information is a no-brainer, and what this presentation is not going to tell you is to stop spending on protection. Installing a natty camera in your doorbell and an associated app on your phone is not going to be cause to stop locking your front door. Daily news reports of data breaches, hacking, ransomware outbreaks, and regulatory fines being levelled at businesses has been sufficient to prompt boards to take cybercrime seriously. But just as we're overcoming the board level attention deficit, what I'd like to show you is that we have a bit of an immediate detection deficit, if you pardon the expression. Oops. Right, so just to set the scene, this is a graph taken from the industry-wide annual breach investigation coordinated by Verizon. It shows results from an analysis of 56,000 security incidents during 2017. And there are certain things to note about the shape of this chart. If you look at those breaches that were analysed, and there are a lot of them, only 10% of breaches that were reviewed ended up with evidence to pinpoint when data exfiltration happened. Organised attackers are increasingly using anti-forensic techniques to frustrate investigation. If the victim has not already helped them, that is, by frustrating forensic evidence on their own, just because the way they decided to manage logs and also respond to breaches. An actual compromise takes seconds, minutes, one bad click, one unpatched hole, one exploited zero-day vulnerability, or just a rogue internal employee is all it can take. Now, some data can be extracted quickly, but attackers are deliberately reducing the speed of data extraction to avoid tripping threshold-based alarms. So a significant and increasing number of exfiltrations are taking hours, days, or even weeks. Now, this is a more up-to-date chart. This is from 2018. It's a graph from an analysis performed by breach investigation company Mandiant, which is now part of FireEye, and it shows that dwell time, the measure of how long a villain is operating inside a compromised network prior to detection, is, well, appalling. Breaches in EMEA were discovered on average within 6 months. If they were detected internally, the average was just under a month, but the average without internal detection was 10 months. What we're hoping to show you in this presentation is that the current security investment strategies in protection, more than anything else, is yielding diminishing returns, and that in contrast, a modicum of attention in other areas of the security spectrum, particularly in the detection field, will deliver a greater reduction in risk to your business. Now, the earliest days of hacking were designed to be sort of very visible. Bragging rights were traded by defacing famous brand websites. Political points and hacktivism were being scored by DDoSing certain targets and then braying if you managed to take a big website down. However, as the internet matured, the financial motive for cybercrime started to become dominant in data breaches. Criminals are constantly evolving their techniques to reduce the time and the risk involved to them in monetizing their criminal activities. 2017 saw a spike in ransomware, particularly with the WannaCry strain, which caused a huge amount of damage. But if we think about that as an example from the criminal's perspective, WannaCry was an indiscriminate, automatically spreading worm. It spread very quickly and widely from initial targets. It was immediately visible and hugely damaging. Security industry response, because of that, was very swift, focused on high levels of collaboration between security researchers, law enforcement, and government. The Bitcoin wallets embedded within the monetization technique that WannaCry was trying to leverage were monitored immediately, and it indicated that the criminals involved seemed to be out of immediate reach in North Korea, netted over the entire course of the campaign a little bit over £100,000. So looking at the reward for criminals for that scale of operation and the amount of law enforcement interest it generated, the risk-reward ratio seems to be very poor. Let's look at a more recent cybercrime approach, cyberjacking. Now, cryptojacking is a technique of stealing CPU cycles, power, bandwidth to conduct mining activities to try and earn cryptocurrency coins. There are a variety of ways of delivering mining scripts to target computing devices, web or traditional malware delivery via email, for example. Successful mining software limits the use of the target's CPU and often restricts processing to times when computing devices are inactive or late at night. Security firm Palo Alto conducted an analysis of hundreds of thousands of examples of cryptojacking software and calculated that at least 5% of the entire value of the popular cryptocurrency Monero was mined by malware. Of course, the value per coin will vary wildly, but at one point the software was generating $30,000 a day for the criminals. As long as the cryptojacking software remains undiscovered, the criminals are at low risk of discovery and retribution. Also, an individual affected by the malware often has no idea and sometimes doesn't care, as the impact on them seems very low. But this is not a victimless crime. The cost of power consumption alone is injurious to the victim and moreover the environment. Let's not forget that just one fork of Bitcoin is now using more electrical power than the entire country of Greece. But I think that's a digression. So the most attractive risk to reward ratio to criminals of these monetization techniques is no longer based on a mass delivery and then a small percentage of victims willing to pay per infection, but the actual amount of time that they can remain undetected on a target device or network. Cyber attacks that rely on dwell time can create money directly by crypto mining, but compromised devices can be co-opted into botnets, which are then sold as a service. Botnet operators sometimes compete to own a device, kicking other malware out and hardening it. Criminals that are aiming to stay are likely to hide their tracks well, making identification and capture via forensic analysis less likely than a smash and grab or an indiscriminate attack. We've seen criminal gangs limiting their targets to reduce the risk of being outed, also an emphasis on proprietorial stealth and anti-forensic techniques in malware, hacking, and exploit tools. There is evidence that criminal gangs are tailoring malware to inject malicious code into specific organizations and focusing efforts on a single high-quality breach with minimal noise and maximum duration. So check out these notable examples of attacks where the value to the criminal was based on stealth and dwell time. Most of these made the trade headlines, and you may be familiar with some of them. Just last year, Ticketmaster, British Airways, New Egg, and others were hit by a form of attack which copied card data, payment card data, as it was transacted on their e-commerce websites. Now, in this case, these organizations spotted it relatively quickly, but because the volume of payment card transactions per unit time, the damage was extensive. Now, these organizations were specifically targeted for compromise with the mining scripts, the domains used, and many other aspects of the attacks being tailored for the purpose. Another trendy form of compromise is to inject malware into point-of-sale terminals in retail organizations and grab card data before the terminal encrypts it, a process called RAM scraping. Retailers are facing costs of hundreds of millions of dollars, but it's taken them months to detect that something is going on. Usually customers with fraud appearing on their cards being the first indication of a compromise. More speedy detection would reduce the levels of fraud for their consumers and excite fewer claims for compensation or penalties from the regulators. The shameful Equifax breach may have lasted over 140 days, allowing attackers to pick the network clean of data and exfiltrate it quietly, as well as covering up their tracks. Accountancy giant Deloitte had to admit that its administrative credentials for its email system had been compromised and client data accessed. They stated publicly that the number of organizations impacted was very small, but investigations conducted couldn't pinpoint when the unauthorized access had happened. Finally, in the relative jewel of long-term data breaches, Starwood, part of the Marriott Hotels chain, had criminals remain undiscovered in their computer network for over 4 years, taking advantage, one assumes, of the disruption of the merger that was going on at the same time. So in summary, looking at this chart, which is a comparison of the threats from 2017 and those of 2018, according to the EU Agency for Network and Information Security, smash and grab attacks like ransomware, which offer poor risk-reward for the criminals, are on the decline. Lingering attacks that rely on long dwell times like cryptojacking are on the rise. So that's my take on the current changing threat landscape. I'm going to introduce our guest speaker, Ian, now, to give us his view of the current state of security that he's experienced. Ian?
Hey, thank you, Max, and it's my great pleasure to be here with the team. So one of the first things that I think, really need to understand about the environment that we're faced with is this wonderful slide here that shows that in 1990, we had what everyone would really refer to as a very sort of castle and moat type of approach to networks and to cybersecurity, where we were pretty much building forts, putting in standard defensive measures such as firewalls, and slowly building out a more robust security perimeter. Oops, let me just go back. There we go. By 2005, it became a lot more diverse. You saw a lot of businesses either merging, partnership, but also relying on a third party, and really having now a trusted and untrusted relationship with different service providers. And really, you know, where we ended up by, I would say, about 2015 with the introduction of cloud and software as a service-based technologies, we have ended up with almost zero traditional perimeter and a tremendous amount of web services. So where we are is essentially now, with the perimeter being gone, our traditional approaches to cybersecurity of the layered defensive measures is really not as appropriate as it used to be, which of course means really two major trends. The first is upskilling the standard capabilities of an IT security department to incorporate this new reality, but also significant business investment in appropriate security technologies. So one of the things that I tend to really focus on is we now need to take a serious look at not having what's called flat networks. Flat networks are incredibly dangerous to an organization because they allow the quick spread of a contagion through the organization. One only needs to look at the damage that WannaCry, NotPetya, Bad Rabbit, and similar type of malware / worms that tore through the infrastructure of giant global companies and did significant damage to the tune of over $1 billion in reported losses. The other piece that we need to take a really big look at is how we use security technologies such as VPN to protect systems that are vulnerable but may be necessary for the business, such as remote desktop protocol. We've seen malicious actors leverage remote desktop protocol to do brute force or credential stuffing attacks to gain a foothold in an organization. Clearly, having remote desktop protocol available to the whole internet is a very bad idea. And this is the type of connection that needs to be, I would say, supplemented with VPN. I think another big trend that we're seeing is egress and ingress filtering. The traditional firewall that we had was really something that prevented bad guys from coming in through, I would say, the overt front door, but quite literally didn't do much to stop exfiltration. So what we're seeing now is a real trend, and this is both in the next generation type of security appliances, but also leveraging the traditional firewall, but actually coming up with a methodology that says this is the destination of the various bits of information that we have. I like to use NTP, Network Time Protocol, as an example of how both ingress and egress filtering can give you a great idea if you have a major problem. So as you know, in a traditional network, you have a Network Time Protocol synchronizing the workstations and the server. In general, workstations within the perimeter of your organization should never be utilizing NTP to go outside and to solicit information or send information using the Network Time Protocol to an external resource. So there's a great example of building a firewall rule and practicing network segmentation in order to potentially catch something that has gotten through your perimeter. Now, I'm a huge, huge fan of documentation, and this is, I think, a major area that we need to focus on, and it really has become the unsung hero, if you will. So One of the ways that you can easily prove due diligence to a regulator or to a compliance department or risk department is to ensure that you have actual documentation of your infrastructure. This is essentially evidence of your due diligence, right? The other thing that documentation allows you to do is really focus on incident response by already knowing and having a good idea of the infrastructure and the potential ingress and egress points to a malicious actor. If your incident response includes something like build a network diagram, this is things that can be done in advance. And I should certainly recommend, system level diagrams as well as information flow diagrams. Really so that you can work with your business partners to understand how information comes in, how it's processed, where it's stored, and how eventually it's moved on to the next system or even externally. So we're just going to move forward. All right. So one of the traditional approaches is that you looking at your security, decide that you're going to look at a security incident engine or management system to deal with all of the telemetry and data that you're receiving. The problem is that it becomes quickly overwhelming if you do not actually have a grip on the basics. So one of the leaps that a lot of companies make is going into a SIM, but unfortunately the SIM, sits in the corner because there's just thousands of alerts and no bandwidth in the organization to investigate. Increasingly, compliance and audit are asking for logging of information. The problem is that the SIM it's all too easy to turn the SIM into the log management solution in an organization, and that becomes problematic from a performance and storage and eventually cost perspective as well. So, the SIM has great value to an organization, but it really needs to be thought of in the context of, is the organization ready? Do the applications and network topology support log collection? Will there be an impact into bandwidth? So I think right now my view is that SIMs are struggling a little bit in the market, and of course, if you are mostly cloud-based, there's the challenge of getting the cloud-based telemetry into a SIM. So of course, a lot of companies now find out about a data breach from their own equipment, but frequently it's coming in by the way of a third-party notification or the arrival of people with badges to tell you that they found your information in a place where it shouldn't be. So one of the issues that we have is, of course, once visibility is established, is what are we going to do about it? And, is there a DFI department? Do you have a digital forensics and incident response capability? How are you going to return to normal business operations? You will have to conduct an investigation. Have you done so before? Do you have playbooks? So all of these issues come down to really understanding what the risk is, combined with what level of due diligence you're practicing and what potential liability you may have. It's really going to drive how much you are willing to invest. And, in a lot of cases, what we found is that the vector of the attack is usually a well-known vector, could have been mitigated, but for whatever reason, internal controls, budget, resources, you unfortunately have suffered a data breach. I like to call this the free pen test versus the proactive pen test argument, where cyber criminals are only too willing to give your business a free pen test, and really there needs to be an investment in the proactive and understanding exactly where your risk is in your organization. So one of the largest attack vectors that we're seeing, and it is truly a noisy attack, especially when it manifests itself in the form of brute forcing passwords, easily guessed passwords on infrastructure, as well as something called credential stuffing, where data from a previous data breach is then used to try and break into other systems. We saw a bunch of attacks a couple of years back, which basically either came from the Yahoo data breach or the LinkedIn data breach or the Adobe data breach many years prior, and led to exploitation of companies like TeamViewer and others. And this was essentially the same passwords, if you can believe it, from 5 or 6 years previous, gave access to the malicious actors, gave access using exactly the same credentials. And of course, you know, the scale of the problem, as I like to say, is unfathomable, in that Troy Hunt at Have I Been Pawned estimates that there are 70 billion credentials that we know of that have been disclosed in public data breaches. That's a little bit daunting, given that we're about 7 billion people on the planet. That essentially means that your potential credentials and personal data has been stolen and breached 7 times on average for every person on the planet. So one of the really interesting things to see in an organization is truly figuring out whether or not you can institute blacklisting of particular passwords. In organizations, there are some pretty common passwords based on the name of the organization that people are using, traditional 90-day password changes of spring, summer, fall, winter, or autumn, as they say. These types of situations are just lining your organization up. So understanding the passwords and that you're using inside your organization, being alert to notifications that user IDs within your domain have been breached becomes a real piece of your toolkit. And I like to call it some of the easiest cyber threat intelligence techniques that you can use to give your organization an edge against the bad guys when they come calling. So, you know, many organizations, and in fact, in the latest 2019 Data Breach Verizon report, it's estimated that I believe 45 to 48% of small, medium businesses were the victims of a data breach last year in their survey. When we think about that, we really start understanding the change in cyber criminal tactics. I think large enterprises have managed to up their game. This is balanced against the extraordinary complexity of large enterprise networks. So even though the breaches of those companies are always substantial, the detection ratio in enterprise, the response ratio in enterprise, I think is narrowing, where the cyber criminal feeding ground, according to the data breach report, is really found in the small, medium business segment. And, you know, what we're seeing is a chance now where the cyber criminals are looking at companies that haven't made an appropriate investment in security, have legacy equipment, are not managing to best practices. It really goes through a pretty horrific process on an organization that may not have the capital resources to survive the attack. You know, I like to talk publicly about Mossack Forensa, who were data breached because of a vulnerability in their content management system on WordPress. The company is no longer viable. It was a large law firm, and the Panama Papers resulted from that. And that has really devastated I'm going to say, an industry that was built on the idea of, I'm going to say, a needle between tax optimization and tax avoidance. So when confidential data like that is leaked onto the internet, the repercussions are absolutely brand traumatic. I would say that when you're faced with a data breach situation, that communication becomes the most important component to that response. We've seen what happens publicly on Twitter and other public forums like Reddit when the business is not forthcoming with the necessary details of the data breach. This only makes the potential regulatory fines and actions that the organization will face post-breach even more, I'm going to say, even more dangerous. The other issue too is that many organizations are really struggling with the idea of putting together a toolkit and educating their users. And unfortunately, especially in the small medium business segment, we see a lot of applications that aren't doing appropriate logging. So it's really difficult then to do any sort of forensic investigation to understand how, when, where, why the bad guys and what they did to your particular system. And again, you know, I go back to that documentation and logs or it didn't happen mantra, because really that forms the basis of understanding, you know, to what extent this data breach has impacted. Nothing is more disconcerting than not knowing precisely what data was accessed and when it was accessed by a malicious actor. I like to say backup, not Bitcoin. You know, that we can get into a long-winded discussion on the merits of paying a ransom or not paying a ransom. I'm a firm believer that the investment in DR and backup capabilities is super important. And then the last issue really with incident response is, are you capable of understanding when it may be a police matter and where and how that you need to engage the police. In the UK, the NCSC is the lead on cyber investigations. Depending on the egregious nature of the data breach, it is very advisable to contact NCSC to gain their help and potential perspective on what has happened and transpired in your organization. So I'm just going to go to my next slide here. There we go. All right. Oops. I'm struggling a little bit with moving to my next slide. Okay. Oops. All right. Credential problem.
It's
here we go. And then it's back to Max. There we go. It's Max and Ian now.
Hello. Thanks, Ian. So a modicum of effort or spend on detection can really reap sizable rewards. I wanted to look at some of the objectives that you can aim for when bolstering your detection capabilities and bring to your attention some of the lower cost rungs of the conceptual ladder of detection solutions, if that will be okay. So detection is not just given short shrift by businesses. It's not really been the focus of many information security standards. If you look at Cyber Essentials, for example, it doesn't dwell much in terms of furnishing your ability to spot when something's gone wrong. Fortunately, this is now being recognized and corrected. So this snippet on the slide is the UK government's 2018 minimum security standards for departments. And it's public information. You can find the whole standard online. But to summarize section 8, for those of you who can't read that text, it's a bit blurry. The least that must be done is to capture device event logs, analyze those logs, and detect known security threats. The objective is that the villains should not be able to use common techniques to gain access or gain control of information systems without being detected. And any services that might be particularly attractive to criminals should have transactional monitoring to prevent fraud. So I think it's educational for private sector charitable organizations to compare where they are with standards that the public sector is giving themselves and to strive to at least stay ahead of that curve.
I think also, Max, this brings up a really important question. If part of your business plan is to expand into councils or organizations that have a relationship with the government, there's a requirement to meet the government's minimum standards in order to do business with the government. So this issue is one that has moved down the supply chain. And I think that's an important aspect, especially to enable the business in those particular sectors.
Yeah, I think the government is very sensitive to supply chain compromise. And as we're seeing cyber criminals attacking smaller organizations to get a foothold in larger ones that are reliant on them, then we'll see these standards being considerably more applicable to SMEs and organizations that sell into the public sector as a matter of course.
Yep.
Right, let's just hop forward here. So don't be alarmed by the amount of text. I've just broken one of the cardinal PowerPoint rules. But I think it's a good idea to have a standard and well publicized within your organization set of indicators that non-IT employees and IT administrators can look for during their everyday work. On the left here are indicators of attack, and on the right are indicators of compromise. And a high proportion of detections start with someone in the organization noticed something unusual. And it's one of the objectives of, very simple objective of cybersecurity awareness training, to make sure that all employees are able to look for basic things like people hanging around the office, strangers with computing devices coming and plugging them in or sitting down at a terminal next to them, unusual phone calls coming in and questions, social media activity, as well as more technical evidence from monitoring systems that you may have deployed and you're using.
One of my favorites here too is strange devices plugged into your network. There was a recent situation where a Raspberry Pi device had been installed and potentially had been installed for many, many months in an organization. So, this is a for real challenge that organizations are faced with. The UK, see it, say it, sorted. There's a cyber equivalent.
What is it's not seeing it though, is it? Or
well, I think when you look at logs and when you look at the telemetry that an organization is generating, a lot of the indications of compromise are a change from a normal baseline of activity. If there's a giant peak of traffic in off hours, that's a sign that something has happened. Hopefully it's normal business operations and can be dismissed with a quick cursory investigation. If it's a bank holiday and terabytes of data are moving out of your organization, that might be a huge concern.
Yeah, absolutely. I've gone one further, and if you like self-punishment, or if you do consultancy like I do, then you could go one further than indicators of attack and look for warning signs of poor security hygiene or a poor security culture, which may indicate an increased risk or likelihood of a breach in certain business units. And a note that security culture is visible to anybody visiting a site or interacting with employees. This includes auditors and regulators. So if it comes to being assessed for responsibility for a breach, it might be worth having a look at what your organization looks like to somebody coming in and looking for risks.
Yeah, this is really a combination of both cyber hygiene, i.e., keeping your organization at a baseline of cybersecurity. But it's also about understanding what your risk is and building, what I like to call cyber threat intelligence program around, what are the most likely avenues of data breach. In financial services, it's web applications. That, according to the latest data we have from the Verizon Data Breach Report 2019, that is the attack vector for financial services organizations. So, understand, what your risk is, understand where the attack is going to come from, and, prepare yourself accordingly.
All too true. So the first steps to good detection actually start a bit earlier on in the security life cycle. So during the identify stage, it's crucial to know what your information systems look like so you can better detect when someone or something is introduced that you did not authorize. And a lot of this comes down to, as Ian said, documentation and record keeping, which is the unsung hero here. This is important to support response and recovery as well as detection. Companies frustrate digital forensics investigations by not keeping good records. They might use monitoring, hacking, or scanning tools themselves without writing down that they are using them. And so when an investigator is looking at a forensic image of a device and it's got all of these hacking tools on it, they may not be aware that those are all internal and they've actually been authorized for use. So a lack of common builds to compare, a lack of understanding of the applications and flows is a real frustration, and sorting that out is important. Now, in terms of detection solutions, I think that logs are the beating heart of detection techniques. All devices and most services do some form of logging, but many are left using default configurations as troubleshooting tools more than security tools. Like most default configurations in the security space, that's not usually useful for detection techniques. In general, companies are not capturing every log they could. They tend to be cycled too quickly for good forensic analysis. And unfortunately, there are still, and ironically, too many of them for good manual analysis. So at the inexpensive end of the detection solution ladder, the lowest rungs alongside user awareness training, there are tools that allow you, with a bit of work, to collect and manage your logs centrally. In addition, you may want to look at opportunities like using secure DNS resolution services. Many organizations still use their ISP to just resolve domain name requests, but using a secure DNS resolution service doesn't have to cost any money at all, but it can give you visibility into any software that's running on the network that is making calls to known external servers or services that are hosting malware. And that can be an early indication that there's something going on the network that you're not comfortable with or haven't authorized. So there are free services for DNS resolution out there if you don't mind a home user experience, but there are business grade resolution services at pretty low cost that can identify risks and give you monthly reports. They're easily implemented at a network level and they don't cost much to cover an entire network estate. You also might, at the lower rungs, look at passive breach detection appliances or honeypots. They can be deployed in sensitive network areas alongside databases or where your managers have their computing devices, and they mimic valuable assets. But if they get port scanned or someone tries to log into them, it's an immediate and high value indicator of compromise, which it doesn't cost much to manage, and it can allow you to slam the shutters down or isolate infected machines very quickly. Now, online services like Have I Been Pwned by Troy Hunt, as Ian said, and Shodan, can give you an indication of what the public internet sees of your user credentials or network, and they're worth registering with to get an alert up front if your company is being looked at in that way. So you can go up in the sophistication and cost ladder for these solutions. And one of the first challenges really comes to automating protection from what you can detect. So detection technologies began with IDS systems, intrusion detection, designed to identify anomalies in east-west traffic, so traffic internal to the network. Changing that to an IPS system where which not only detects an anomaly but also proactively protects the network from any degradation from that may have its downsides in terms of detecting a false positive and then responding when it shouldn't. And so a lot of companies have found IDS and IPS to be very heavy in management costs as opposed to just buying the device and the license. There's another issue with interposing protection systems at land speeds because they may impact network performance, whereas detection technology can sit out of band and at least give you some chance of spotting perhaps after the event whether something bad has happened in the immediate past. With a sizable volume of logs, it's an ideal position to consider log management with some kind of analytics. Now, a SEAM would suit organizations that already have some kind of security operations capability, but with the advent of decent machine learning techniques and AI, some of the low-level initial triage, which happens on logs, and you can introduce some kind of real-time response capabilities, even if it's just an alert to the IT manager to have a look at something that looks strange or unusual. It needs care to implement these kind of things in networks because, of course, if you automate, you can be causing yourself more headaches rather than fewer headaches. Now, that detection might not be in real time, and it doesn't have to be in order to be useful. If we go back to the earlier graphs, we're aiming to detect breaches in a matter of days rather than weeks, and analysing logs in batches may be a reasonable strategy that could be worth considering. To support that, a good company plans for response and recovery before the discovery of a breach, so no one is caught napping. Now, that's all I really wanted to say for the moment. I'm aware that there was a lot of material to cover and we probably spent more on it than we needed to. I just wanted to hand back to Lorna, summarise the general points for detection capabilities before we tackle your questions. Lorna?
Thank you, Max. We have a little summary slide here in terms of what an organisation should do really to get started on their journey in breach detection. I was wondering, Max, if you wouldn't mind just summarising these points.
Yeah, sure, that's no problem. I mean, it's difficult to come up with a generic set of appropriate steps that every organization will find useful. And so this is sort of my best efforts at a 5-step program, I guess. Some organizations will be stronger in some of these areas than others. But I think that the starting point of, if you walk into a company as a brand new CISO, the first question on your mind is, what have I got? What am I protecting? And so being able to do an audit and inventory of information assets, and better, moreover, being able to keep that up to date, preferably by putting in a real-time view of users, computing devices, network connections, flows, and where your data is at any point in time is a critical first step. For all organizations, visibility is important. The second thing specifically to do with logs is we've got all of these logs hanging around on the network. Let's do something with them. Let's make sure that when we have decided to make use of this value that we have within the network, that we can set down the policy for how long we're going to keep it for, where we're going to keep it, and get that done. Visibility tools might need to be added to eliminate blind spots. So I mentioned DNS resolution previously. There's a wealth of data to be captured through looking at who's typing in what into a web browser, what software is referencing which servers outside the company. User training is always lacking in organizations. You can always do more in this space. And even if it's just a simple half an hour YouTube video that you can spread around your employees to say what to look for and how to treat anomalies once they spot them, will improve your detection efforts. Because of the challenges to do with volume and false positives, it might be necessary to focus your breach detection efforts on your most valuable assets. So think like a hacker. What are they going to be able to monetize quickly and with lower risk? And for companies like Equifax, for example, the value is not necessarily the same for them as it is for data subjects, and they are protected by GDPR and other regulation. So it's important to get your story straight. And the last thing, really, if you pardon the pitch, is to seek advice from an expert. Find a partner that you are comfortable with, that you trust, to listen to you and help you close that detection deficit, because I think a little bit of spend on detection is right now going to deliver much more value than a spend in the protection space, assuming that you've met your kind of minimum cyber essentials, if you like, for firewalls and malware protection.
Thank you, Max. That's fantastic. So we're now going to begin answering the questions submitted today. Just as a reminder, you can still submit any questions through the questions pane on your control panel. So we will do our best to answer as many questions as we can. We are running short on time. If we don't get to answer your question, we will be in touch with you on an individual basis to make sure your question is answered. So our first question is, can you tell us a little bit more about cryptojacking malware? How serious a threat is it, and how can I go about detecting it?
Do you want me to take that one, Max?
Yeah, you start off, Ian, and I'll fill in any gaps.
So the idea is essentially that a compromised computer or even Internet of Things device, like a router or a camera, can be used by the bad guys to generate currency by mining it using the algorithms and software that are uploaded surreptitiously to the device. Now, a couple of things. Clearly, devices that are on all the time, like servers, especially website servers or SQL servers, database servers that are providing the services, are a favorite target of attack, as are poorly secured Internet of Things devices. Now, there's a number of different techniques that are used. One, of course, is to land the malware specifically on the actual device and then, get that device to do the mining itself. Another attack is to upload a malicious script to the server itself, and then the server serves that malicious script to anyone visiting the website. We saw this with the infamous CoinHive attacks that targeted a number of different websites. And it should also be noted that it doesn't necessarily have to be the actual website that is targeted. If you have either a cross-site scripting vulnerability or a web plugin coming from a third party where the third party has been compromised, which was the case when the ICO's website was compromised by a third party plugin that they were using, and that started serving a crypto mining script to anyone visiting the website. So every technique in the book will be utilized once the bad guys have had access to an always on, or preferably always on, device.
Thank you, Ian. So another question that's just come in from an SME saying that that really they've got limited budget and people for security. They're not big enough to have a SOC service. What can they do to get started with breach detection? Should I pass that one to you, Max?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think every organization has a slightly different approach to security spend and how they manage it. But clearly we're at a point here where the experience of implementing intrusion prevention and intrusion detection systems has shown us that the expensive part is the bums on seats in order to analyze the output from these systems. So it's not really the fixed cost of the service or the box that's doing the anomaly detection or the alarm. It's the person or the service that you decide to lean on in terms to analyze the output. Now, there are free tools available to at least get the basics of the documentation up to scratch to make sure that your logs are collected and retained and are available for subsequent audit, which I would say would be very inexpensive for a smaller organization to put into place, because once you've got those processes and tools in place, they will run themselves with quite low management overheads. Where you might want to take a step up is looking at sort of the modern advent of machine learning and AI to review logs on your behalf, which can be cheaper than hiring somebody to do that job, even part-time. And it's awake 24/7. It might not be as good at spotting threats as a human might be, but it does have a lot of compensations in terms of availability and in its ability to spot something unusual going on the network. So once you've kind of fulfilled the requirements of getting registered free of charge, making sure your plan is in place, that you know who's responsible, and that you've done your training, all of which are pretty low cost to do. Having a look at some of these tools that you could put into place to give you a bit of extra visibility and control of weird stuff happening, I think would be a good place to start.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Max. How does a breach detection system differ from a traditional honeypot? Good question. Pass that one over to you, Ian.
Okay, I was going to probably let Max take
okay,
this one.
Sure. I was just trying to share out the questions, but yeah, please, Max, fire away.
Sure. I mean, honeypots have been around for a long time. I think the first one I saw was towards the end of the 1990s, and they're systems which, by definition, are meant to be hacked. They're meant to be attacked. They come in a variety of complexities and sophistications, and so they vary in price wildly. So when somebody says traditional honeypot, I'm not sure there is any single traditional honeypot. There are a variety of different systems. Now, you could see them as a spectrum between, at the simplest end, something that is designed to just ring the alarm bell if somebody tries to log into it or somebody tries to scan it. And these are quite low cost appliances, either virtual or actual, that you can just plug into the network, give them an address, configure them, and they're up and running. At the other end of the spectrum are those honeypots that are used for forensic analysis. They've got sandboxing capabilities. They've got the ability to track hackers as they log in and start to move around on the device. So they're learning the tools and techniques of the hacking software or the hacking team that are trying to penetrate the system. And those are much more costly to put into place. Now, breach detection could encompass honeypots as part of the design, but breach detection is a broader term. So you can spot breaches without having honeypots attached to the network, just by good log management and review. But a honeypot can be an excellent and relatively low-cost way of putting something passive in the network that can then give you a shout when something bad is going. And it's the quality of the detection that's important, because you absolutely know that that is a hacker operating inside the network. There's very little room for false positives, which is the usual problem with analyzing logs and looking at network events.
Okay,
I think also, I just want to add one thing to that really quick. It's really important that you put your honeypot strategy strategically. Having it on the outside or in the DMZ of a company is really not going to provide that much value, because the internet's a really hostile place and it's going to get hit an awful lot. But put it close to and segregated into a sensitive part of your network where your defenses are robust, and then you'll have a really good capability. So I think, you know, placement is very important.
Okay, great. We've got quite a few questions that have come in on sort of compliance and reporting issues, so I think we'll just answer one of those today. So regarding ISO 27001, is breach detection enough to cover the requirements for information security, incident management, and reporting?
So if ISO 27001 is the framework, or NIST, or whatever that you're using, there's two components. There's the capability, and then there's the response. There's two components to that. So I tend to look at this as, if you have a fire alarm, but no one knows what to do when the fire alarm goes off, you're going to fail your compliance tests, right? Mm-hmm. So Max, help me out on this one, because I think that's a really important distinction that when you're talking about applying a framework to a compliance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 27001 is a massive task for organizations to try and live up to. But of course, it's, you know, at its sharpest end, which is in the controls that you want to implement, not all of which are technical, by the way. Some of them are about just having a policy, and also making sure that that policy has management backing, that the policy has been implemented, and that people follow the policy. And not just at the point where the policy is written, but, you know, 6 months, a year, 2 years down the line. So it implies a level of constant refreshing and testing of the process and the people that support the information security objectives. But I mean, ISO itself has a lot to say about logs and log management and breach detection capabilities. There are entire segments of the 114 controls that are inside the standard. There are many of them that are purely about detection and how to make sure that, as a company, the detected event is followed up by somebody doing something, and having that all agreed at peacetime, not during the event itself.
Okay, that's fantastic. I think we'll end the Q&A session there. Thank you, everybody who posed a question. We will get back to you if we weren't able to answer that today. So we are nearly out of time now, but I just wanted to briefly mention that we are offering all webinar attendees and webinar registrations the chance to get started on improving their breach detection straight away. So if you could email marketing@activereach.net to register your interest in a free 30-day proof of concept, that would be fantastic. It really is a great opportunity to gain visibility on any a breach detection consultancy package, so you will be fully supported from start to finish. So I'd just like to round up today's session by saying thank you to Max and to Ian, and thank you everybody for attending. If you have any other questions or would like to discuss your organization's current breach detection challenges, please do contact us via email. Either marketing@activereach.net, or you can reach out directly to Max on max.pritchard@activereach.net. We have also provided some handouts to accompany today's session. Please see the handout section on your control panel to download these. Once you leave the webinar today, you will receive a short survey, and we would really appreciate it if you would complete that and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within the next few days with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. So on behalf of ActiveReach and our speakers, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.